Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second plenary, the end of our second day. So in a few minutes, we're going to be joined by Natasha Speer. She's going to give us our second plenary. It looks like we're going to do things at the table, so be prepared. All right, so I just have a couple sort of quick announcements, and then we'll get going. Announcement number one: if you signed up for a dinner on the sign-up sheet, you will meet in the lobby at the Circle of Sofas at 6:45 p.m. So there are some dinner groups that are going. If you signed up 6:45 p.m., so you can all go together to the dinner reservation. Number two, if you are leaving tomorrow morning, when you exit here, please put your name badges at the counter. You can just do that right now and then come right back. That would also work. Then we'll know you're leaving too. All right. Tomorrow morning, where there's a NSF funding special session with James Alvarez and Elise Lockwood, it will be in this room. So we have breakfast 7 to 8:30. That special session starts at 8:15. You can bring your breakfast in here. The session will be in here. Sit up closer. Don't sit in the back for the session. So we'll have plenty of room for that. That's 8:15 tomorrow. And also virtual attendance is encouraged. There will be board games again, as there were last night in the lobby tonight. And also there's a group going rock climbing. There was this email sent out. They wanted me to announce it just in case anybody was on the fence. Where's Megan? All right, so rock climbing. If you want to go rock climbing tonight, do it. All right. All right, and then the last, so in just a minute here, I'm going to call up Dave Kung, who's going to introduce Natasha Speer. Natasha will give us our plenary. I'll then close the session with a sentence. 5-ish minutes after that, there will be a moment of remembrance for Karen Keene. So, and there's a small event. Anybody who would like to attend it is able to attend it. And so we'll have like maybe 5-minute kind of passing period. So if people needed to go to dinner or you're able to do that. But that will also happen tonight after the plenary. And yeah, those are all my announcements. So I'm going to have Dave Kung come up and he's going to introduce our plenary speaker, Natasha Speer.
Thanks very much. Thrilled to be here. I'm particularly thrilled to be introducing Natasha. This is her 22nd RUME conference attending in person. We tried to do some thinking really quickly to see who might be ahead of that. I think Rena and Annie have actually been to slightly fewer than that. I think Shandy has been physically to 24 of them and virtually to the last one, the 25th. Anybody else in the Michelle Zandier? Yeah. Have you been to all of them? Maybe missed one. It feels very poetic to me to be introducing Natasha. We first met at one of the RUME conferences. We first met in Scottsdale, which I think was like 2002 or something like that. It was a very memorable time. We had been introduced to each other virtually before that, but we finally got to meet in person there. And since then, we've had an immense number of collaborations. We have given talks together. We have written papers together. We have visited each other's houses. We know each other's families fairly well. We wrote a book together. All of these things, some of them went well. One of them took 16 years. That'd be the book. But through all of it, it's just been enormously fun. And I've always appreciated her ability to have both an enormous amount of fun doing things, but also to sort of keep me honest and keep the work honest and always sort of try to push us forward in terms of the knowledge that we have, what it takes to help students understand more mathematics, to help teachers be able to teach more mathematics. And it's just been an enormous, a fantastic part of my career. And I'm very grateful to you. And I'm honored that I get the chance to stand up here and introduce you. among the many things that she has done, you can look up a lot of these if you'd like to online. She's taken on the work of training, of providing professional development for TAs, and done an enormous amount of work there. First in co-mines, back to video cases project that Shandy was in on, and then in co-mines, college math instructor development source. Thank you for helping me out with that. And also the working group that has met here at RUME for many years, the working group on college math instructor professional growth. It was the first working group at RUME, and this year was the 21st year they have met. So yeah, that deserves a little whoop or some claps. And it's enormous growth. I think in the first couple of years there were very few people in that room. I think it was just Shandy and Natasha sitting at it. It was a working group. It was more of a working duo than a working group. But this, raise your hand if you came to the professional development for college math. Like there was and it's just an enormous group that has done some fantastic things. Among the many things she has done for the RUME community is really worked to expand it. She started bringing master's students who probably had no aim of being researchers within of RUME, but they got a lot out of this conference, and she brought them. And I think that's been something that a lot of others have done as well. And she was also one of the people, along with Warren, to really help get the connections with physics education and deepen those and bring more people here. When I think back to the time we met back in Scottsdale, we had, I bet you remember this, we had this lovely lunch, and there were like 5 or 6, maybe 7 of us at this table. And for some reason we got on the topic of, what did you do? Like, what did you do that wasn't related to the work that we do in mathematics education? And some of those really stuck with us, and we were really memorable. I learned that Shandy had a whole career in Hollywood. You can ask about it. I learned that day that Natasha at some point was writing obituaries. Unexpected. There was a lot of music involved. Eric Sue, who is not here, but many of you know him. Eric Sue played in a rock band. Myself, I was a wedding musician for many years back in grad school. And Natasha's instrument is piano. She does not sing. If we want singing at the end of this plenary, we have to get Warren back up here. I don't see a piano, so I think we're not going to do a piano, but so no music today. But please help me welcome Natasha Speer.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to get used to all the technology here. I'm going to let you in a little bit behind the curtain. I have my own laptop here so I can see my notes, because what you all are seeing and what I'm seeing on the screen here is just the slides. And sometimes I need a little reminder here and there. So I will have dueling remotes here as well. So thank you very much, Dave, for the lovely introduction. And also many, many thanks to the organizers for inviting me. And here you can see what the title is, for inviting me to give this talk. When I realized that this was going to be the 25th room, and that I'd been to nearly all of them, and that folks in RUME had contributed so much to the broader math education community, that really got me thinking about our past and also our future. And so today I want to take you on a little bit of a journey, because I started wondering what the next 25 years of RUME might look like, and how we can organize ourselves during those years to have our work have even more impact in the future than it's had in the past. And in particular, curious what sort of very deliberate, specific things we might choose to do now that would set us up for even more success in the future. Because we've done amazing things, but it'd be nice to see if we can improve upon that in the future and as well. So today I'm going to invite you to do some of that thinking as well. I'm going to ask you to think a little bit about your future work in your own area, as well as these larger issues for the community. So you may have seen this slide up when you came in, and I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to contemplate an example of something that you have experienced that you think was really successful as an educational effort. That could mean it helped students learn better, helped teachers teach better, it was effective curriculum implementation. And by familiar with, it could be that you experienced it as a student, or maybe you were an instructor or a researcher. And I want you to consider, what are some of the things that you think made that go well? Said differently, what are some of the reasons that the effort did what it was intended to do? So I'd ask you to take a couple minutes to just think to yourself, and then please turn to your neighbor. If you don't know them already, say hello, chat for a few moments, and I'm going to be walking around listening in on your conversation. All right. And so with all well-intentioned group work activities, I'm going to pull you back together just as you're all getting deep into the ideas. So it was lovely to get to hear ideas around the room. There's clearly a lot of wisdom contained in just this room, let alone the whole broader room community, about what it is that we need to do in order to ensure an effort is successful. I heard things about it being about the relationships between the people involved, and that things have to be a collaboration. I heard ideas about being able to think about a smaller problem to tackle and not trying to tackle it all at once, so that you can be successful and people can feel good, and also so you can learn from that and build on that. So there is this great deal of wisdom that we have, and a lot of that wisdom has been captured in our artifacts from research. And it's been captured in journal articles, our RUME conference proceedings, and there's a lot of that for us to take advantage of. But learning and teaching is really complex and messy, as you all well know. And there are things that features of us as math people that sometimes are helpful in this endeavor and sometimes can get in the way. So we like to be able to define our variables and be able to order things and solve equations. And the world is often a lot messier than that, as evidenced by this quote. And then although we know a lot of things, sometimes the wisdom that we've developed in this community doesn't always get fully utilized in the work that happens out in classrooms. And so, whoops, I went forward. You weren't supposed to see that yet. Gave it away. And so a lot of the wisdom is captured. However, sometimes things don't always go as we want them to go. And we may want to do we may want to figure out a little bit more about that. So there have been lots of calls over the years, and you just saw some of them, for change and for improvement. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to look at these quotes and read them. And I'm going to ask you to do something with them, but I'm going to stand over here. And when you've kind of digested these, been able to read them, if you can just look towards me so I know it's okay to move on, that would be helpful. All right. Seeing a bunch of eyes in this direction. So now I'm going to ask you to pick out one or two of these and try to guess the year it was said. All right. Curious? Want to find out the answers? All right, so here's a little timeline. Here we are in 2020. And so one of these quotes is from fairly recently. We know much more about effective math education and how it increases access than we did just 10 years ago, but there's still huge gaps in our knowledge. And then there's another quote, quote D there, about better teaching methods are needed by university faculty. So that occurred a little bit earlier. And we can fill in here that educators, as they entered a particular decade, people were recognizing the need to respond to change. This one's a little sad. By this date, almost none of the concept methods or big ideas of modern math programs had appeared. Reliable reports actually changed, that practices had actually changed, were rare in comparison to the literature of advocacy. And the final one, successful execution seemed to be of fundamental importance. Anyone want to guess what the other endpoint of that timeline is? 1903 is that first quote, and then they're spread out over the decades there. So we've been saying these things in the community for a long time. And these big picture issues are incredibly complex. And so, and it's often a moving target that we're trying to hit, things change about what we want to be doing in education. And so just as we figure out how to do something, maybe the sands shift and there's more to be thinking about. But there's another recurring, and so there's a slightly sobering story because we've been at this for over 100 years and still the calls for change keep coming. But there's a different story that has a much happier tone to it and potentially a very powerful lesson that we can learn. And so I'm giving you a couple more quotes here. I'm going to do the same thing. Take a look at these. All right, all you qualitative research types, what's the theme in all this? Something about like active learning, engaged student learning practices. And you can probably guess that we're going to play the same game again with the timeline. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. So just take a minute, guess a year for one of these, just in your head. And here we go. So the most recent one of those quotes is from pretty recent, and that we have this large and ever growing body of education research that demonstrated that these approaches to instruction are good for students. Way back in 1900 something or another, there were markedly superior results demonstrated by the use of this particular approach to learning, which was very similar to engaged student learning practices that we talk about today. And then there are a whole bunch more in between. And so again, we might say, well, we've been at this for a century. Isn't this a little discouraging? We keep trying, we keep trying. I actually think that there's a very positive and powerful story here, because in parallel with all of this, we in this community and the broader education research community have learned a ton about why these approaches are helpful for students, how to organize student time so that they can learn from this, how to develop curriculum materials so they have these learning opportunities, how to help instructors engage students in these ways, the types of questions to ask, all sorts of things. And so while there's some similar sort of things to the previous set of slides, this is a much happier story. And so there's still tons of work for us to do in this arena to figure out how we use these practices in ways that are equitable and provide access to learning for everyone. But we've learned a ton. And so what might we do with all of this wisdom about this type of active learning approach to instruction? And so I'm going to use a little bit of a timeline from my own work to structure the next little adventure in the story. So I'm going to go back to 1998. And I was at a session at the joint math meetings that involved TJ Murphy and several other people. And it was designed to showcase programs for TA professional development, back in the day called TA training programs. And the idea was to bring together a dozen or so people who had designed programs in their departments for them to share out what those programs look like, because it wasn't as common then as it is now for their program to exist. And there wasn't as good of, internet wasn't as good, so you couldn't just easily share what you were doing in your program. So we thought, let's showcase them. And so we did. And that was fine. What most of the talks was, hi, I designed this TA professional development program based on what I know and how I learned to teach, and I'm going to tell you about it. And there's great value in sharing that, but that was the level of the conversation that was going on about these programs. And so then, fast forward to 2017, and I'm sitting in a room kind of like this one, and there were sessions going on about undergraduate math education and math education more broadly. And many of the sessions were talking about and making use of a lot of the research that had accumulated about what good teaching looks like and how students learn well. And when the session came up that was about TA professional development, you want to guess what happened? It was still a set of stories about, I designed this program and here's why I think it is good. And again, there's a lot of value in all of that, but most of what people were saying did not reflect any of the information that we had accumulated between 1998 and 2017, let alone the rest of the history. And this was a little discouraging. And so I left the session. I called TJ Murphy on the phone. And I said, TJ, this is what happened, and told her the story. And I said, I don't want to be sitting in this room again 19 years from now and have the same thing happen. We've been working hard for almost 19 years at that point, right? We've been working hard to try to help people learn more about the teaching and learning of graduate students. As Dave was mentioning, we had a working group. That working group had been in existence for a long time. We had started the Co-Minds project already. So we had been working hard on this, and yet we felt like the impact of our work just wasn't being seen. And so we started to think about what might we do if we're going to think 19 years in the future, how might we make the stories that get told and the ways things get talked about different in the future? So what would, whoops, whoa, this is getting out of control here. What would we want a talk title to be? Title of a session, a quote. What would we want it to say in 2036 if our efforts had been successful in having professional development more informed by research on teaching and learning? And so we found this kind of an interesting exercise to do. And so it was, thinking about the future and trying to think where we wanted to be has been important as we've been moving forward. And so I found that useful, and I think maybe you might as well. So now I'm going to ask you to go ahead and think for yourself about, in your own world, your own research, or in the broader math ed community, what would you like quotes to say? Instead of those ones at the beginning, remember the ones that like everything's the same since 1902, what would you like those quotes to say if we had utilized all that we know from our research in order to inform the teaching and learning of undergraduate math? Either the big picture, your instructional practices, your own area of work, or something else. So I'm going to give you a moment to think about that. I'd like you, if you want, to share these ideas. That QR code there and the tiny URL will take you to a Padlet. If that is a word you do not know and don't wish to learn about, do not fear. We have low-tech and high-tech ways. There are Post-it notes and pencils on your table. You may use those to write out what your aspirational quote is, or you can use the QR code and go to Padlet, where you will see a screen, and then you click on this magenta plus button, and it gives you a virtual Post-it where you type a title and what you want to say, and then you publish it. And just so you know, this type of activity is called future casting. Forecasting is when you try to predict what will happen. This is you letting go of those constraints and trying to envision what might happen and that you want to happen. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to do this. And you can talk to people if you want to. Oh, someone's figured out the Padlet. Have you had a chance to think about all your future hopes and dreams? So let's take a look at this. They're going to switch the thing. Oh, and there we go. So take a look and see what folks are saying about their aspirations for the future. Some comments about equitable active learning. And those of you who are using the Padlet can, of course, browse on your own seeing this. So these represent some of the places we'd like to be, whether in the big picture. I now I've given you an activity and you're all engaged reading it. I'm going to try to pull you back for a moment. I promise we will come back to being able to think about this in a little bit, but these are just some of the ideas of places we might want to be in the future in terms of the big picture issues that we're addressing in our work, or smaller subsets of issues that we are working on in this community. And one of the ways that it's sometimes useful to think about how to get to a place is to think about history and what things we might learn from the past to get us there. And so in my own work on graduate students and instructor professional growth, the things that are really important have to do with teachers and their practices. And if we go back to the PowerPoint now, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey. Oops, there we go. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey and another timeline. So this is representing some ideas from the K-12 math ed community. And up until about 1960s, a lot of things had happened. There'd been a lot of curriculum development efforts where mathematicians and others created materials for use in classrooms. They gave them to teachers, teachers used them, and then they tried to decide whether it had worked by looking at student outcomes, maybe tests, maybe grades. And there's value in doing that sort of work for sure. However, what was happening was when something worked, they didn't really know why necessarily. And when it didn't work, also didn't know why it didn't work. And so it was very difficult to make a lot of progress, because if it didn't work, you just start over again, let's make another curriculum. And there weren't ways to really know what was going on. And then in around 1960, people started saying, well, what are math teachers doing in classrooms? What's actually happening when we hand teachers curriculum materials? And for those of you who are new to all of this, it may seem crazy that we didn't look at what was going on in classrooms, but we kind of didn't up until that point. And that was a really important moment in time for the K-12 education research community, because not only did it allow them to find ways to make the work they were doing more effective, but really importantly, it informed research questions that they could investigate that were more grounded in the actual problems of practice that teachers were encountering and the actual things that were going on with students. So it's a pretty important moment in time. And you can imagine that this is an important thing in my own work, like knowing what teachers do. And so you might be wondering whether this is the sort of work that has happened in RUME. And it coincidentally happens that I did some work with two colleagues to do a literature review to find out whether this was the sort of work that we had been doing in the undergraduate context. And this work was with Jack Smith and Aladar Horvath. And Jack Smith and I used to carpool together when we were both faculty at Michigan State University. And he was doing some work on the high school college transition. And one day he just asked me, what do we know about what calculus teachers do? I said, I don't know. I don't think we know that much. We know about curriculum materials and some other things. I don't think we know that much about what goes on in those classrooms in these buildings. And he went, really? I went, yeah, I think so. It's like, well, maybe we should find out. That's kind of interesting. So we did this literature review, and our claim was that it was mostly an unexamined practice at that point, where the practice means the things that teachers do and think in class and out of class to do their work. And we were especially interested in things where there was actual empirical data, like examinable data on those teachers, as opposed to things where people were talking about what they thought teaching should look like or what their own experiences were. And so we searched in various ways. And actually what we did was we hired the grad student to search, and it's kind of a terrible thing to do to a grad student, say, I've got a job for you this summer. I want you to search for literature I'm pretty sure doesn't exist. And so it was great for him, but he searched, and at that time, we found 5 papers that actually had data on what was going on with instructors in college mathematics classrooms. There is much, much more since then. I haven't read all the papers that have come out that have cited this, and I'm sure not all of them are additional studies, but there are many, many more studies now than there were then. And that's really great, because this helps us understand key things about what goes on in our classrooms, not just how do people plan their classes, which is super important, but if we're caring about active learning, we want to know more about how are teachers making decisions in the moment to pursue a particular idea of a student, to understand what a student is saying, to make sense of their mathematical ideas. So this type of work was incredibly important for the K-12 world in moving their world forward. And I think it has been important for our world as well. So this was the start of sort of a new way to understand the impact of this was one way of understanding the impact of things. And there were some other things that have happened in the future, but first I'm going to connect these dots for you. So that was 2000-ish. And so that's the sort of slope of the line between when things started happening in K-12 and when they started happening in our community. There was another important moment that happened in the K-12 world where after folks started looking at teaching and teachers, they thought, I wonder what it is that you need to know in order to teach in particular ways. And this is the part where people started going beyond just how many math classes have they taken or what math problems can they solve on a math test. This was starting to look at mathematical knowledge for teaching. And those of you familiar with that area of work know that this was incredibly important in the K-12 world. It's generated tremendous advances in what we know and understand and are able to do. And so if that's the case, and if as things have been going, our work lags a little bit behind in terms of time because of when we got started, maybe we should consider what we know about the knowledge used in teaching. And so I started doing this work with some colleagues a long time ago, actually. Last night, Warren mentioned the Truce Conference back in 2017, I think. I met two people there who were also interested in this, a biology educator and a chemistry education researcher. And our feeling was that there wasn't very much research out there about this. And so we set out to check this claim that it was scarce. And so we searched. This time we didn't have a grad student. And so it took us 5 years to do the searching because it was faculty doing this in between things. Ginger had to get tenure. Tessa had a couple babies, stuff happens. So we searched. And when we did our search, we found 45 articles in total across all the different STEM disciplines, and 15 were in math. We win. Our findings were that indeed, the literature is relatively scarce. If you do a little Google search of mathematical knowledge for teaching, even just that, you will find thousands and thousands of articles set in the K-12 context. And here we are with our 15. The other thing that became incredibly apparent quickly was that we live in disciplinary silos. It is lovely that we have physics and chemistry educators coming here and that we learn to talk to one another. And if you were at Warren's talk, you heard some of his story about that. But in the literature, it is very siloed, meaning that the way we in the math world talk about knowledge for teaching is different than the way people in science ed talk about it. And within science ed, they don't always talk about it in the same way. And it includes, we name things differently. So even if you try your best to find the literature that might be relevant in another discipline, your Google Scholar search is not going to help you very much because you're searching for this other term that isn't what they use. And that is all a reflection of different theoretical perspectives we've taken on this work. And so that was one thing we noticed. The other thing we noticed is that a lot of the work at that point, at least, has been done by asking teachers to say what they know. And I do this sort of work. You interview people and you give them a task and you say, tell me what you know about student thinking or analyze this student work. And that's fine. And that's really useful and has been valuable in the K-12 world. But some of the most powerful work has been when we look at knowledge in use. We actually look at it in the wild, how teachers are actually using their knowledge to do things. And so one of our recommendations was that more of the work be based in the actual classroom practices. And the good news is that some people have started to try to understand how knowledge supports teachers to enact all those good teaching practices that we've been hearing about for 120 years. And so we are making some progress in that way. And that's part of what could be very valuable about this line of research. So back to our timeline. So there we are in the 1980s with what knowledge is used in teaching. And we did that lit review in 2010. And there's been we did the lit review, and the earliest work that we found was from about 2010. So you can see that we're continuing to do things in the same order that has been done at K-12 and with some delay. And if you look closely, maybe the slope's getting a little steeper, just maybe, just maybe. So, whoops, sorry. So if we now add a dot in there for today, and we think about what it is that we might want to do in our own future, perhaps it would be good for us to think about and look at what's been going on since then. Like the 1980s were a long time ago. Some of us were alive then, but like it was a long, long time ago. And so what is it that's been going on? And remember these quotes from before? Oops, no, those quotes from before, the ones about actively learning. This was the happy story, like even though this has been going on for a long time, we've learned a lot about it. And so that's good. And so one of the things that has happened in the K-12 world to a certain extent is that they have decided to consider what happens if we design learning to teach opportunities for instructors or teachers in the same way that we design learning mathematics opportunities for students. So what happens if we take everything we know about how students learn math well, group work, inquiry, collaboration, all that stuff, and we try to do that with teachers? Could be kind of a cool thing. We could leverage the knowledge that we have already. We've learned a lot about learning. Could we apply this to teachers? And people have done this in various ways. And I'm going to tell you just about 2 examples of that. The first example is from an NSF-funded teaching fellowship program for people who are beginning their careers and as math and science secondary teachers. And the goal was to help them support using all of those active learning approaches that we were just talking about. And the initial design was the thing that I and many people have done. Let's have some meetings where we bring teachers together, and we're going to bring in people who are experts and know things, and they're going to talk about things that are important, like let's talk about question strategies. Let's talk about interacting with students and facilitating group work. And they did all of this, and it was lovely in some ways. And in fact, the teachers were kind of doing okay. But in the mid-project evaluation from the external evaluation team, the teachers were like, but those meetings, they just are not valuable at all. And so this was a big kind of moment in the project. And so folks stepped back and said, well, what can we do? And so what they did was said, what happens if we ask the teachers what their problems of practice are that they're interested in working on, and what the things are that they're finding challenging that they'd like some help with? So they asked them, and the organizer took all of those things and kind of sorted them and grouped them, did a little qualitative analysis there to group things. And the teachers then spent the year meeting monthly in these groups to work on these tasks. And the outcome, first of all, was that the teachers were much happier and found it more productive. But was really interesting was the things they chose to focus on are things that the organizers were thrilled by. They were exactly the things they wanted them to focus on: fostering resilient learners, inquiry, equity and access, student engagement, cognitive demand, all these things that we know would be really great for teachers to spend some time thinking about. The teachers came up with that on their own. And in the end, not only did this make this more productive for the teachers, the time they spent, but the final evaluation suggested that it had this huge impact on their teaching practices. They'd been able to work on the things that mattered to them, and that was more meaningful. And this approach shares all the features of like great active learning in math, right? We've got people working on meaningful problems in groups, talking to each other with a goal of improving something. And the facilitators walked around and helped and lent their knowledge. And that's how they brought in the ideas from research. They did the sort of just in time. Oh, you're talking about this. That sounds like this sort of cognitive demand issue. So I think that this is a lovely example and a way of taking things that we know about learning and applying it to teaching. And we've done a little bit of this in our own work. We ran a workshop that was for people who were experienced providers. So some of you have been to the workshops for people designing math professional development programs for graduate students. And this is for people who are experienced providers. And our goal was to support them and help them expand their knowledge and skills. And we used a particular approach, and give the credit to Emily Braley, who's sitting over there, as one of the authors of this idea. We're going to make everyone a participant and everyone a presenter. We're going to ask you not just what do you have to say at a conference, but what do you want to learn? And then we're going to organize you in groups based on stuff that you know that other people want to learn, and you as a group are going to figure out how to help your co-participants learn. So everyone designed sessions and everyone was a presenter and a participant. And again, the same thing happened that had happened with that other group of teachers, where when you ask people what are the things they know about and want to learn about, they choose really great things, right? They want to focus on issues of equity and diversity. They want to think about evaluation and about instructional design and a whole bunch of other things. And so it was a very useful experience for us to realize that there's a lot of wisdom in the group of people we're working with, and that we might be able to leverage that in a whole lot of ways that we had never thought about before. And we didn't, and so back to my own timeline. So we did this work in, whoops, sorry, my slides are going crazy. We did this work to try to improve things up to 2017, and I told you that story, and we were working towards 2036 to see what we could do. And as we thought about what we wanted our goals to be, we weren't necessarily conscious of this timeline thing and all the resources we might use, but we did have in mind that we would really like to see the world in our future casting be that instructor professional development is informed by research findings about learning, not just student learning, but also instructor learning. But there are tremendous things that we can know from what we've already done in research on learning that might help us with this problem. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit. So here's the timeline. So there's the story of 1998 up through 2019. And then we have done some things since then, but we also have more to do. Those are those green dots. So we have a lot of work in our own world to figure out how can we continue to leverage the emerging research that comes about this specifically, and the things that we have been able to learn from history. So there are a couple of themes that have sort of emerged as I and other people have thought through these things. I'm going to just share a couple of those now. So I think it'd be really great if right now we tried to learn more from our own and other people's wisdom about things related to learning and apply it to learning to teach. I think that's a real space that we have the potential to make great improvements in. In the future, we're going to have to do that whole cycle of like looking at teaching and figuring out what the knowledge for teaching is, but at this meta level. So when I talked to the people who were running that professional development program for the teachers, and they described the teachers working in the groups, I said to them, so what did you do as the facilitators? And they were very deferential to the teachers. Oh no, I put them in the groups and they did all the work. It was all the teachers. And I tried to ask, like, what did you do? And I finally got some of the things out of them, but it reminded me of early work when we would talk about group work and sometimes say, well, we put them in groups and then sort of like magic happens, like the math learning just happens. And what the instructor was doing was sort of invisible because it wasn't someone at the front of the board writing. With someone walking around and talking to students. So we're in that same position when it comes to learning about teaching. And so maybe we can make some progress in that in the future. Another thing is, that I have not mentioned in great detail, but I think is incredibly important, is we have certain advantages in the way that undergraduate math education, math departments are structured that K-12 people don't have, that maybe we can take advantage of. So there are people in our midst in many of our departments who are providing professional development to faculty, to graduate students, to learning assistants. They are course coordinators. They are doing other sorts of things, maybe in a professor of the practice position. And these have become more common over the past few years. These folk know a ton about what's going on in classrooms. And those of you who work with folks in these positions know that it's often the course coordinator or someone else who is really the one who's going to ensure that a certain way of teaching is being implemented in that way, or curriculum materials are being used in a particular way. They're on the ground with folks. So I think that there's a lot we could do to take advantage of that, not just to help our efforts have more impact, but also to learn more about what those problems of practice are. They're kind of like spies about what's going on, right? They have they've been spying on what's going on and hearing what's going on in all of these classes that we, if we're not directly involved in that work, may not have access to, but could really benefit from learning more about as we think about our research questions. So in the future, though, it would be great if, just like in our own research, where we might have a group of people we talk about locally about math or about math education, we might have that folk, but then we come to these sorts of conferences and maybe we have big collaborations across institutions to solve problems of mathematics and other things. It would be great if in the future we learned how to collaborate across institutions to, as groups of folk, try to solve the problems that we're encountering in the practice. Two last things. One is a lot of this wisdom from practice is invisible. I bet many of us, I will speak for myself, I've got a bunch of stuff written down on this laptop here that is things I've learned from my own teaching or from my own work with teachers, and it's never going to get published. Just never. Because I don't know what theory to use to explain it. It's outside my area of expertise. It would have been kind of professionally ill-advised for me to take a detour to do that sort of work while I was trying to get tenure or whatever. But there's a lot of ideas that, a lot of things that have happened that I think were valuable and useful, and I've continued to think about them, but I've got no place to share them except to like tell someone about. And that's true for us as researchers. It's also really, really true for people who are on the ground doing professional development or working with teachers. That wisdom from their practice is just not part of what we see in our communities. And so it'd be great if we did, not just because those ideas would be out there, but for those of us with research hats on, we might understand something more about what would be a productive type of project to do that would really be keyed to these problems of practice. In the future, it'd be really nice if that sort of intellectual scholarly work that we do, thinking about our teaching and thinking about these ideas, could have a home that was not just our laptops, and that it could have more of status in our community. I know it's important that we establish ourselves as being theory-driven, serious research folk, and we do that a lot, and that's great. But I think there's some room for having other types of publications and other sorts of work be shared in the community, and that would also help us develop some research questions that were really grounded in practice. If you're wondering what that little reference is there to it's to a really lovely article by Abraham Arkabi, who wrote about the origins of a whole bunch of research questions and projects that he worked on, talking about how particular moments of him interacting with students or a collaborator interacting with a student or a teacher was a spark for a very productive line of research, but that those stories are cut out of the journal articles. We don't say how we got the idea to do the study, we just do the study. Finally, I strongly encourage us to start imagining what our future looks like, and doing the sort of exercise we did before of thinking about what you might want it to look like, and look at the mathematics education research that about those key factors that can really help you plan for that future, like we were doing with teachers and teacher knowledge. And in fact, a little while ago, I had you do this and think about what those factors are. And so you already have a set of things that you could start looking at the history of to see what that might do for you. And so in sort of school teacher way, I had you start your homework in class, and now you can go and finish that homework if you so desire. So what we might do then in the future is look to those in other disciplines. We've already heard yesterday, and you probably know, there are things from science education that can be very, very valuable for us, but there are things further afield that maybe even a little harder to get your hands around, but things in policy, organizational development, behavioral economics, they all can help us with these challenging issues. In fact, the behavioral organizational development folk have written a lot about that process of asking people what they're interested in working on, and then strategies for consolidating that and getting people to form groups and agree on what things are most important for them to work on. So there's some actual structures and ways of doing that. And we could learn from people to try to improve what the impact is of our work. And so, like, there's the relevant history that you might consider, and then there's also these things outside this. And so just one final thought. This is another callback to Warren. Last night, Warren mentioned a quote. He was quoting Dave, and he was talking about issues of bias and equity, and saying it's not our fault that there are these issues, but it's our responsibility. And I think I believe a similar thing about this situation. The fact that we haven't yet solved all of the problems of creating rich learning opportunities for all students everywhere, that's not our fault. But I do think it's our responsibility to try to figure out how we might do better in the future. Oops, wrong way. Yeah. Thank you. And before we turn to questions, and comments, which I'm thrilled to hear, if you'd be interested in doing this work, because it's kind of hard and interesting work about thinking how we go forward to have as much impact on learning as we possibly can in a sort of planful, deliberate way, I encourage you to go to that QR code or the tiny URL, and you can just indicate that you'd be interested in joining a conversation. I have no idea what I'm going to do with these responses if I get them, but I'll figure that out, or figure it out with all of you. And there's a place for you to suggest other things, but beyond the 3 suggestions that I made there. But I do really invite you to see if we can start a conversation about this, so that those of us who have been in RUME and gotten to see our efforts, our work have some impact, can help ensure that the folk who are new to this have an opportunity to have their work have even more of an impact in the future.
We've got one question back here already.
Natasha,
Annie.
yes. So I really applaud your work, but now I want to know how some of us who do domain specific stuff, like how students have difficulty with derivatives or epistemological obstacles of proof and all that stuff. That's a lot of our work. Now, where does that fit in with your work?
Do you mean where does that fit in with preparing people to teach, or do you mean where does it fit in with this game I'm suggesting we play of thinking forward and backward?
Yes, I mean.
Perfect. Well, one of the things is, although you're saying that it's domain specific, there are things that are more generalizable, I know, around proof. And that's been going on for a long time. And you've been involved in that work. So you probably know your own relevant history because you lived it and created a lot of it. But perhaps there are things about how students speak to each other. Maybe there's some things about student interactions as they're working on these problems that has a longer history that you might be able to learn from, or thinking about what would you like it to be in the future. Are there things about that you have learned in how students learned to think about proof and how students learn that you might be able to apply when you try to help other people teach in those ways? I know you've learned a lot about how people learn stuff, so I imagine that you have those ideas.
So here.
Oh, there.
Your talk has this theme about how do we make change and the role that our creation of knowledge has in having some impact in the world, right? And that sort of sense of applied research is very laudable,
Mhm.
and it also corresponds well sometimes with individuals' intentions to improve practice, their own practice. But I'm wondering how you reconcile that also with the notion that making change is just part of the economy, that the economy of products in the world is based on the idea that we never have enough of what we want and that we want more or we want something different.
Mhm.
And I would like to hear more of a second guessing of that position. Is it possible that it's just a smoke screen, that we are pursuing some sort of smoke screen that is preventing us from actually increasing our knowledge?
Oh, let me see if I understand what you're saying, that the nature of the world is that we're going to keep seeing those quotes about there needs to be change forever. Like that timeline can go forever. And that if we focus on that, we might miss out on some other things. Yeah, that's interesting. Certainly, it seems like in some areas, things don't ever change. But I think that we do have examples from the earlier activity we did where people said, describe something that was successful. I asked you to think about something that had been successful that allowed some change to happen in how students learn. I do think that we do have examples where things change. And I'd be interested in talking more, but I don't see why it can't be both are true, that maybe there are forces that keep us in this thing, but that if we don't, and that may be the case, but if we don't ever envision how it might be different, then I'm pretty sure it's not going to be different. So maybe step one is let's try envisioning it to be different and figure out what we might do. We still may fail. And hopefully we'll learn something along the way. But I think that for me, at least, I think that visioning part is a really important thing. And maybe that does a little bit for the smokescreeny sort of issue. But I agree that could be the way the world is. I just don't know.
This is a comment from our Zoom friends.
Oh,
Aida Eilbeck, in the context of looking towards the future, what role people bridging K-12, I'm screwing this question up, but how bridging K-12 and RUME research, what are the roles people can play? What interactions, relationships can boost RUME research momentum to make the slope even steeper?
yeah. How do we make that slope steeper? Well, one of the things that I'll speak specifically for the work around teacher growth. I do think that the fact that we have folk in our midst, that we are living in the departments that we are often trying to help change, and that we have a variety of people in roles as instructors, graduate students, learning assistants, faculty, and we have this other layer of folk in there serving in roles of course coordinators and teaching focused faculty and providers of professional development. I do think that we have an opportunity to maybe accelerate a little bit our work on this teaching and this learning for teaching work, because we have all of those folk as informants right local to us. One of the challenges for folks, maybe some people do this sort of work of working out in schools, is that they're out in schools. And also, it is not always the case that someone who is doing research on how sixth graders understand an idea was themselves a sixth grade teacher. So there's also a little bit of a separation there. But most of us have taught undergraduate math to undergraduates. And so we have that knowledge and we have these people in our midst. And so maybe if we figure out how to do like group work for change in a department where we bring all of those folks together, maybe that would be a way we could make a bit of advances, and maybe we'll be the ones to figure that out and then be able to help enhance what's already going on in some circles of the K-12 world. But yeah, it'd be nice to have different slopes there.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a quick question. So I'm going to piggyback on the previous question, not the previous one, but the one before that.
Okay.
So you told us about these examples in K-12 where we see these changes happening earlier than in college education. And I was wondering, you mentioned something about results, that there have been some results of success. And I want to see if you can tell me like some of these
success results as indicators that what we're doing might be good.
Oh, right. So correct me if I'm wrong, but like, what's happened in the past in the K-12 world that might like make us feel good about what we're doing now? Yes. So two of those examples were the things I talked about where looking at classrooms and classroom teachers and understanding what really goes on in that classroom has been wildly useful in the K-12 world so that the reforms can be more tuned to realities of classrooms. I am not saying that there aren't a whole lot of other problems still solved. We have not fixed it all by any stretch of the imagination, but when there is success, it does seem to be often that it was something that was grounded in, embedded in a particular teaching situation, involved teachers as informants. So that's something that has been a success that we could adopt. And similarly, I think we got to know a lot more about the knowledge we use in teaching college math, because there are things about it that are different. We can't just say it's the same. So we have to do our work there. But once we do that, we might really be in a good, do more of it. We might be in a really good spot to help people develop that knowledge as they are at the beginning of their instructional career, instead of it being, oh, you taught for 30 years and now you know how students think about these integration problems.
All right, we have time for one more, if there's one more. All right, let's thank Natasha one more time.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh. You saw the shameless plug for the co-mines things. There are green, alarmingly green things back there for you to pick up if you want. Thank you very much. It's awkward transition.
Yes, so this concludes the second day of the RUME conference. So as a reminder, 6:45 to meet if you are going to a dinner. So we'll take this time for, so anybody who is going to leave is able to do that. Anybody who wants to stay, we'll get started in about 5 minutes. And we're also going to stop the recording. Can we stop the recording of the plenary?